Hello, and welcome to the Decent Ideas podcast, where decent needn't necessarily mean polite in an indecent time. Nor should it mean perfect for obvious reasons. What it must mean is fitting and suitable to that time. I'm Terence. So, a little while ago, we engaged in a 2-episode conversation on colonialism and global conflicts with an eye towards how the U.S. should cease its participation in neocolonial exploitation around the world and form coalitions as an aspirational partner in increasing democracy at home and abroad. But in light of the response to the ongoing withdrawal from Afghanistan, I wanted to zero in more on the U.S. military and how we act on the world stage, both in terms of the warlike stance we take and in terms of humanitarian aid. So I wanted to start off in a similar way to the way I started the last time that we touched on, this sort of series of topics around the military and how we project our power into the world. And so the way I did that was by going into the ongoing armed conflicts by the number of fatalities so far this year. So I wanted to do that again today as just sort of a point of reference for kind of the state of armed conflict around the world. And as I said last time, the numbers I'm about to give are approximate and can be colored by any kind of politicization of data. So as I said last time, please keep that in mind in terms of these numbers. They're just for the purpose of sort of framing the discussion generally. So interestingly, in the middle of this ongoing withdrawal from Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan still holds the title for the most deaths this year, which stands at about 34,700. Coming in second is the Tigray War in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, which is estimated somewhere between 17,000 and 49,000. Coming in at number 3 is the war in Yemen, also sometimes called the Yemeni crisis, which currently stands at 10,800 fatalities so far this year. Next up is the Mexican drug war, which stands at about 8,300 deaths this year. After that comes the Boko Haram insurgency, which is mainly going on in Nigeria and Cameroon, which stands at about 5,500 deaths. After that comes the Syrian civil war, which sits at about 3,700 deaths. And finally, the internal conflict in Myanmar, centering around the Rohingya genocide, which currently sits at 3,300 deaths. On top of that, as I referred to the last time we talked, again, broadly on this subject, we have a number of, humanitarian crises that don't have necessarily as high a number of actual casualties, nor are they always technically wars, though in some cases they are. So this category is meant to kind of tackle issues that we broadly care about or broadly hear about as a country, but again, might not be as violent in the sense of the number of deaths occurring. And so in that list, I would put Israel-Palestine, which had about 340 deaths this year so far. The Russo-Ukrainian War, which includes the war in Donbass, which stands at about 108 deaths this year. That war is primarily impacting Ukraine, which it currently is, I think, either the poorest or perhaps the second poorest country in all of Europe. So that's an important sort of point of framing for the crisis. I would also include the Uyghur crisis in western China in the Xinjiang province, which we don't really have a number of casualties. According to some information that we know, it's possible that there isn't directly killings going on there so much as humanitarian abuses, the detainment of Uyghurs in camps, and finally the North Korean issue, if you will, of a country that is so isolated from the world, and you hear occasionally folks that escape from there and the hardship that they face under the dictatorship of Kim Jong-un. So again, I wanted to kind of bring up these two sort of categories of conflict or humanitarian crisis because I think it's important for us to recognize the degree that we're involved in these areas, the degree that we talk about these areas, that they permeate our media discourse. And this also goes to another thing I brought up last time we discussed this, which was the kind of boogeymen around the world that the U.S. Talks about, which are causing harm. I think it's fair to say, in all cases, are causing harm. But there is a question about the degree to which we spend our time and focus on those areas to the exclusion of others, right? So the boogeymen that I'm talking about are Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And then we also kind of have former geographic boogeymen. I like to put into the list Iraq as a sort of previous boogeyman for his dictatorial reign in Iraq, where he basically was, literally one of the biggest state sponsors of death of his people in his country at the time, as compared to other state sponsors of death in their countries. Obviously, we deposed him, but I think it's useful context because he used to be sort of lumped in with these other countries that are being led by geopolitical rivals, shall we say, of the U.S. And then I also talked about two sort of ideological boogeymen that are sort of more nebulous, that aren't necessarily tied to a particular state, but that we nevertheless are leveraged in our discourse in ways that we should at least question. And those are the ideological boogeyman of Islamist terrorism and the ideological boogeyman of socialism. And so I'd add one sort of thing to this list, which I think is sort of interesting, which is the folks that you think might make sense as ideological boogeymen and yet are not generally taken as such by our government and by mainstream media as much, I would say. And that's, in this case, the big one I'd think of is white supremacist terrorism, which Biden did make a statement earlier this year, I think it was in April, about basically white supremacist terrorism being, quote, the most lethal threat, unquote, to the U.S. And yet you don't see us invading other countries where white supremacism is, making gains. Like Hungary might be a good example of this, with Viktor Orban, who perhaps white supremacy isn't precisely the right word for him, but he certainly has exhibited a lot of xenophobic tendencies in his leadership of Hungary that suggest, an alliance with the far right movement internationally. And so, in addition to that, I'd probably just add, kind of for the sake of shaping the full picture here, is that in addition to these, all these, conflicts, all these boogeymen, all these, areas of the world that we're concerned about that are, experiencing a lot of strife, we also are not totally withdrawn from Iraq yet, despite, a public statement of withdrawal. And we also continue to be involved in drone strikes and raids in Somalia. So that's kind of the picture of where we are in terms of what we're involved in internationally or choosing not to be involved in. And so, with that kind of groundwork laid, I wanted to talk about the state of the Afghanistan withdrawal and kind of reflect a little bit on, where we stand as a result of that war, that we are essentially, at least thus far, as of today's date, the date of this recording, which is the 23rd of August, we are withdrawing. We are admitting defeat and ceding the country, really, to the Taliban. So I guess I want to start off with a question, which is like, what did the war in Afghanistan get us? And I think the unfortunate answer, and perhaps one that is being um, manipulated or framed in a certain way by the media, shall we say. The fact is that we didn't really get much, right? It has been jarring to many of us, including apparently our president, how quickly the Taliban was able to take back over the country, and we're learning from news reports that there were some kind of patronage agreements where warlords and parts of the country that were previously belligerent with the Taliban have basically agreed not to act out, if you will, in exchange for peace of some stripe with this new force that is attempting to reassert itself in Kabul as the preeminent force, which is the Taliban themselves. So yeah, so it strikes me we didn't get much of anything really out of this 20-year conflict, and I think we have to be honest with ourselves about that. In fact, if anything, what we got is the same kind of thing that has befallen those who have tried to institute some sort of system on Afghanistan before, which is more extremism. I think so far signs point to the idea that while there are some public displays of a more sort of institutional attempt by the Taliban to assert itself on the world stage as a viable government, that at some point resentment will likely set in for you know us fighting them for decades now. And of course, there have been many sort of allusions made to the Vietnam War from the standpoint of sort of asymmetric warfare, right? That basically we were held off by guerrilla warfare and by asymmetric tactics that you wouldn't, normally see in a full-blown war like we saw in, the major world wars or what have you. So it begs the question: what do we do about asymmetric warfare? It seems that we haven't found a way to effectively combat asymmetric warfare, despite being a much stronger force, theoretically a much more capable and well-trained force. Yet we're still getting bogged down in these conflicts that go nowhere. So to me, I guess really where I come down on this is kind of obvious, right? Which is we're doing something wrong, right? We're not engaging with our enemies in a way that leads to lasting change. It's crazy, honestly. And whenever I think about it, I balk a little bit at how quickly this all fell apart. And to my mind, the answer is sort of simple, which is that we can't engage militarily in this way at all. That isn't to say that there aren't going to be circumstances where it makes sense to deploy troops. I am not opposed to military intervention as a whole, and that will surprise some people who are new to the podcast or have heard me speak on issues that are definitively leftist takes. And I think there's a certain degree to which the online left, at least, and probably a good bit of the institutional left as well, basically frowns upon all intervention or interventionism, as some will frame it. And my take is that, this isn't a new take. If you have seen the two-part conversation on foreign policy before, which is that I do think if we go in with the right goals in mind, and if we take a more concerted approach in conjunction with our allies, with a particular goal in mind, and are willing to admit defeat quickly if things are not going our way, that there are going to be reasons, I think decent reasons, to say, well, we should intervene, to make sure that vulnerable populations are protected, especially amongst our allies. And this is made evident by the fact that you generally don't see attacks against those people that are directly our allies, those countries that are directly our allies, such that we have pacts with them that if someone does invade or attack that country, then we are obliged to respond. You do see that those alliances tend to be enough of a deterrent to stop that. And so I guess then the question really becomes who should be our allies in these kinds of battles. And again, my answer is probably a little on the simple side, which is that our allies should be the people, should be the forces in those countries that are seeking something better, that are seeking democracy, to be honest. And I think we have too often, our military, I would say, has too often exploited that argument in a bad faith way, that have said, oh, well, we're just here for the Afghan people. But honestly, when you look back at this war, what do you see as the way that we've assisted, that we fundamentally changed in an incontrovertible way the lives of the Afghan people? I don't think you can really with confidence state that we've done anything yet, as the Taliban looks to reverse a lot of those changes, a lot of those attempts at increasing education levels, at creating a better human rights apparatus for women and that sort of thing. And so I think I've said this in previous episodes, but at the end of the day, the reason that I so strongly did advocate for the withdrawal of forces from Afghanistan is because we really need to reevaluate our approach there. I've heard some people say on the left that we need to essentially acknowledge the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. I would not go that far. That strikes me as an ideological statement too conciliatory, if you will, of the Taliban, of who they are and what they have done. What we can start to think about is how to encourage them to have democratic elections. And that doesn't mean that we, as one country, moderate their elections and dictate the winner. What it does mean is that we work with democratic allies, folks that we trust to hold us accountable if we were to act improperly as arbiters of these elections, these hypothetical elections, that we work with our allies to say, okay, how can we set an infrastructure in place such that elections can be held? And I know that sounds pretty idealistic of me, but I do hold strong to the notion that what we used to call in the foreign policy academic world soft power, right? We used to project this idea that we were the bastion of democracy, and I think that we've lost a lot of credibility on that front. But if we can project a real sense of this is about making sure the people have a voice, I can't help but believe that Afghan citizens would support us, and that the Taliban would have a tough time denying that opportunity, especially if we do it with the right allies, especially if we frame it in the right way of like, okay, well, this isn't about, empowering your enemies. The Northern Alliance, I think, is one of the main enemies of the Taliban in the country. And now they've reformed as the so-called Second Resistance in the wake of the so-called fall of Kabul. So it's not about empowering their enemies, it's about empowering the people. And it means also recognizing that the Taliban is not going away, that they will have to have a say, that this is the way of national reconciliation, is that rival factions come together and agree on a way forward for the country. And basically, what we can do is we can take advantage of this sort of charm offensive that the Taliban is engaging in right now, where they're trying to say, "Oh, well, we'll, you know, allow girls to go to school, and we'll relax some, you know, we'll only apply Sharia law in the proper way," and all these sort of things that at least, give the appearance of attempting to be conciliatory. We can use that as an opportunity to move things forward in Afghanistan. But so again, so this kind of, to me, this is all about the sort of broader. This brings us to like the broader conversation of what should our goals be for getting involved in conflicts going forward. Should they be about protecting people who live in other countries, or should they be about stopping people from conducting attacks on the U.S. and our allies, or should they be neither? And I guess another good example of this that sort of points to this question is the war in Syria and the war in Iraq, and our support for the Kurds in those countries. And to me, I do, again, of course, support the withdrawal of all troops from Iraq as well. But I think the exception, if there should be any, is to continue to support the Kurds. And by the way, this isn't meant as like I don't mean this in the sense of, support them continuing the fight so much as support a discussion for, well, what should be the future of, the land that some call Kurdistan in light of the colonial era, where we sort of drew arbitrary lines as Europe and the US to basically determine these new boundaries, that perhaps it's time to reform those boundaries again and reform those boundaries according to the will of the people. In my mind, we should seriously consider the idea of a nation of Kurdistan, should that be what the Kurds want, and the minority groups that cohabitate with the Kurds and resist what they see as invading or at least belligerent groups against them. And I mean, the more difficult question, obviously, is, when do we step in and fight on their side? And I think that really has to be taken on a case by case basis. For my part, like I say, we've tried to be in Afghanistan and Iraq and to defend these people, and to at least, on the optics, to present a front as we're protecting them and fighting on their behalf, despite the known sort of but quietly spoken concerns about natural resources and what have you. I remember reading some article talking about how there's $1 trillion worth of mineral wealth that's sitting in Afghanistan that no one's able to leverage because of the chaos there. So we have to keep those things in mind when we talk about this as well. But I guess the main point is one that I've kind of already made, which is that we need to be willing to cut and run. I guess is a good way to put it, and admit where we're not making improvements. And that sounds a little bit facile to say it out loud, but when it comes to these questions of protecting others, or whether they're our allies or just helpless minority groups, I think we have to be careful, we have to be strategic, and we have to be willing, I think, to admit defeat. If we can diffuse the conflict, if we can stem the violence and slow the amount of death, if you will, that is a worthy cause. But once we've reached a certain threshold, which again is situationally dependent, then we need to be willing to say, okay, well, enough is enough, right? So I guess another question that this brings up for me is removing or extracting despotic leaders important and or useful? So in the case of Afghanistan, it does strike me that it was a worthy endeavor to remove Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al Qaeda. I personally think, and this might come across as a little bit ahistorical of an idea, but I think honestly it would have been better to take Osama bin Laden alive and to basically remove him intact, but remove him as a force leading Al Qaeda. And so, all this is to say that I actually do think it's relevant to consider ways of being more strategic, of employing more tactical operations. And I should say that I speak as someone who's not a veteran, not a member of the armed forces or a former one. But I think that at the least, when we talk about civilian leadership of the military in the way that our country holds that as a value, that we should consider, how do we employ this idea on a military level of trying to at least take out the kind of cancer, if you will, of a malevolent force, if you will, on a country, and use that as a point of leverage to change the conversation. And so another question I had is, is aiding democratization possible? And I've talked about this previously, but I do believe in, and this, I think I've alluded to this again this episode, I do believe that we should work towards a new international coalition for true democratization. We do have a way in the US of installing leaders that are loyal to us, but that aren't necessarily forces for democracy in their countries. Before we hated Saddam Hussein, we supported Saddam Hussein. Before we hated Osama bin Laden, we supported Osama bin Laden. And this is a dark set of stains on our history because we want our allies to be pliant. We have a desire to say, well, it's better to have a quote unquote benevolent dictator, by which we mean, someone that we can work with, than a democracy that that might oppose us, that might have a different idea for how democracy should work, for example, that might seem more savory than ours. But I think we really need to encourage a move to say, well, it's better to have democracy, even if it's a kind of democracy that makes it more averse to our geopolitical desires in that area, because ultimately what you're building is potential future allies, and not allies on everything, but allies on certain things. And I think that is a value that we really need to work on espousing in terms of our approach internationally. And so another question I had is, can anything be done to undo the influence of colonialism? And I think I've touched on it a bit already. I think offering an opportunity for borders to be democratized, and I talk about this in the context of my political advocacy outside of the podcast, which I've referenced before, which is the Decent Federalism Project, decentfedproject.org. We talk about democratizing state borders, and I think there is an international application for this as well, that the best way to start to scrub away at the stains of colonialism and neocolonialism on these countries is to offer a framework for them to choose what borders seem relevant and prudent for them. Afghanistan and Pakistan present an interesting sort of case study in this, in that the south of Afghanistan is highly Pashtun, while the north is very sort of ethnically diverse, with Tajiks and Uzbeks and what have you, that have a very different culture, a very different sort of sense of identity than the Pashtun people do. And so that is relevant, I think, when talking about how we begin even thinking about undoing the influence of colonialism, which has had crazy influence on the state of our world. And when we talk about the first world versus the third world, or the developed world as opposed to the developing world or the industrialized world as opposed to, what have you. What we're really talking about is the countries that have been exploited and the countries that have done the exploiting. And so if we ever are to be the bastion for democracy that we often claim to be, that we need to start thinking about steps like this. So there's another decent idea for you. So two other quick things I wanted to just touch on is what's the role of humanitarian aid and what's the role of sanctions, if you will, the carrots and sticks that aren't, direct military involvement, that aren't direct warlike stances against other countries. And, humanitarian aid is a really tricky and complicated issue, but I think there is something to be said for alleviating direct suffering. So in the case of hunger, which is a huge component of the Yemeni crisis, when the odds are so dire, that is a time to bring to bear food and resources for people to help people survive, to help people make it through famine in the middle of civil war. There is a place for it. And I think there you can, again, sort of create a patronage relationship there, which is something that we should avoid. But when it comes to addressing sort of the harshest humanitarian crises, which, by the way, we may start to see more and more of in the era of climate change, humanitarian aid is important. And, so that's the carrot side. As for the stick side, the role of sanctions. Sanctions are tricky because often sanctions fall on the people that most need help. It is very hard to target sanctions properly. And this is something that I will admit I'm still learning about, trying to frame to be honest, coherent approach on when it is appropriate to levy sanctions and when it is not. I talked about, this ideological boogeyman of socialism. We have, I believe, we've at least renewed business and travel restrictions on Cuba, under the Trump administration that have not, as far as I understand it, been unwound again by the Biden White House. To me, the Cuban sanctions are ridiculous and nonsensical. There's no reason for them. They're not. What is our goal in sanctioning Cuba? We don't perhaps agree with their particular brand of socialism as a country, though I would imagine, I know that there are many sympathizers to their system and their form of government. They were able to produce their own vaccine. A small island nation was able to, produce a vaccine to deal with a pandemic. That's extraordinary and should be lauded by countries like ours. So, again, on this question of sanctions, it's a difficult issue, but it's one that I'm thinking about, and I encourage you to send me your thoughts on, where sanctions are useful, if ever, and if they're not useful, is there another instrument, another diplomatic instrument that you can think of that would make more sense as a stick that isn't a bayonet at the end of a rifle, if that analogy fits. But yeah, I wanted to just take, an episode to get into kind of the state of things following this, or in the midst of this withdrawal. And I'll keep coming back to this issue. I think it's one that's near and dear to my heart. I think I've mentioned that I have a background in this, that my undergraduate degree is in international relations, and that I, for the longest time, thought I was going to be a diplomat. And so I care deeply about this issue. While it's not generally the focus of my political advocacy, it is one that matters to me. So thank you for hearing me out. And I think we'll leave it there for now. So, as usual, I'm available to chat on Twitter at DecentFedPROJ. Or we'd love it if you hit the like button and engage in the comments if you're watching on YouTube. For those who don't know, depending on how you're taking this in, you can subscribe to the podcast on YouTube by searching Decent Federalism Project, and on most audio podcast platforms by searching Decent Ideas Podcast. We'd also be deeply honored if you share this podcast with a friend on social media. So next time, we'll discuss a new and hopefully timely issue that deserves a new set of eyes. I'll keep you guessing on what comes next. Until then, as always, be decent to one another. I hope you fare well, and thank you so much for listening.